Okay, so my presentation is on the English food immigration from England to Canada, and it's all about how food affects the immigration progress and my grandmother's story. So, how food affects life? It's basically it will trigger memories and it'll determine whether you're in a good mood or a bad mood. So, when you have a positive memory, if you're eating a food at that time, every time you eat that food, it's gonna bring back that positive memory and all those positive things you're feeling. It's also a way for people to connect. So when you're when people get together for dinner, they're connecting with food. So if generally when you get together with someone, you go for dinner or lunch, and that's how people connect. So some traditional English foods are bread, cheese, fish and seafood, shellfish, uh, pies, pastries, and pudding is generally a popular English food, along with sausages and sandwiches. You find that a lot in England. Some English meal traditions, starting with afternoon tea, is just a way for people to get together in the afternoon. It's a way to talk about, or to get together and chat over a cup of tea. Very popular in England. The Sunday roast is where family gets together and they cook a big roast on Sundays, a way to connect with your family. And desserts are really popular. They have it after each meal. So the story is of my grandmother, who lived in England for 16 years, born on January 12th, 1939. She lived in Lincoln, which is a not very known town. It's a smaller town, not really a big tourist attraction. She lived there for a while as a kid until she was a teenager, and then was convinced by her uncle to move to Canada because he thought that there would be better opportunities for her. So the travel for her was by airplane. It took 8 hours, wasn't a long flight, so it was quite easy for her. She left in 1957. Simple process since she's from England. Oh, one thing with travel, they had to land on an ice patch because they ran out of gas midway through the flight. So that's kind of not a very good time. They arrived in Richmond, and within a month, she found a job that was a payroll job with the BC Telephone Company, which is now known as TELUS. Settling to Canada was quite easy for her since she was already English and spoke the language. She knew people there, so she had connections, so it was easy to kind of get in and settle with everyone. So how food plays a part. Like I said before, it was easier for her since she had such good experiences. Every time that she eats a food, it's going to remind her of that experience and everything that happened in her immigration process. She still remembers today her first meal in Canada, which was actually a white spot, and her first drink was a milkshake when she landed. And those are the sources, and I can just show you some of the artifacts that I have. So this tea set is from England. Wasn't from 1950s. It's more recent, but it's still a cool artifact that she had for quite a long time. Here is some old English tickets.
Nice.
That would have been used when they were flying. Here's a map of the route that she took from Lincoln to Richmond. So Lincoln is kind of coast side of England. And here is a menu of traditional English foods. So stuff like roast beef, Yorkshire pudding, fish and chips,
Nice.
bangers and mash, and all that. Do you guys have any questions, comments?
Yeah, amazing tea set.
Huh?
Amazing tea set.
Thank you.
Where exactly did they immigrate from? What city?
Oh, Lincoln. Lincoln in Lincolnshire.
Okay.
So Lincolnshire is the province of England.
And who came? Just your grandmother?
Just my grandmother, yeah. She traveled by herself.
Did traditional English food change after like you guys came to Canada?
Not really. My grandmother still eats some of the traditional English foods that she ate when she was a kid, and still cooks meals like that. So
Do you like traditional English food?
yeah, it's great. Love it. Love it. Any other questions? No.
All right.
Good.
Okay, so my project is basically on the immigration experiences of Koreans in Canada, from Korea to Canada. So a brief history on Korean immigration. The first Koreans to arrive in Canada were around 50 years ago. They were sent here by Christians who went to Canada, Korea as missionaries. They were sent here as students. Very few settled in Canada. By 1965, there were only around like 70 permanent settlements, permanent residences in Canada. But however, in the 1966 reform of the Immigration Act, many Koreans decided to immigrate to Canada, looking for a better life. So in the 1990s, there were around 200,000 from the original 70 back in 1965, which was amazing, which was significant growth. Ever since you no longer needed a visa to go to Canada and Korea back and forth as citizens, annually there has been 150 immigrants per year, which is pretty amazing. So this is a picture of Koreatown, Toronto, which is one of the biggest communities in Canada for Korean people. And some interesting facts about Korea, Korean immigration in Canada. According to the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, there were 2,993 Koreans in Canada, living in Canada permanently in 2013, while just over 100,000 were here in 2001, which means the number doubled in only a decade. As well, the majority of Koreans in Canada were foreign-born, since Koreans have only been here for such a short time, only around 50 years. The Korean population is growing rather quickly, especially Vancouver. There has been a 69% increase ever since 1996. Also, the 2001 census showed that Korean population in Canada over the years of age of 15 is twice as likely to have a university degree as well as be in university. So some Korean Canadians you may know. Here is a hockey player called Jim Pate. He played for the Pittsburgh Penguins, the LA Kings, and the Ottawa Senators. He was even part of the Stanley Cup win for the Pittsburgh Penguins. If you ever watched CTV Late Night, you might recognize her. Min Jung Lee is the TV broadcaster and anchor for CTV Late Night News at 11. She came here around 1971, and she said when she first came here, the Korean community was non-existent, which just showed how recently Koreans have come to Canada. Sandra Oh is best known for her role as a doctor in Grey's Anatomy, and she also came around here. She was born around the same time, but she was born here as a second-generation. Yuna Martin is a Vancouverite who was the first one to ever hold federal public office in the federal level, and she's part of the Senate. She has helped many Koreans feel more comfortable coming to Canada. And more Koreans feel comfortable coming to Canada. So here were the two interviews that I did. Basically all the answers they gave. The most interesting part was that 3 of the answers, they gave identical answers. So why did you decide to immigrate to Canada? Both of their parents decided that coming to Canada would give an overall better experience for their children, and that was the main reason why. They also felt like the most important thing that they left behind were friends that they had beforehand, which I think is because the interviewees were mostly students, and they didn't And the friends were probably most likely the most important thing they could have possibly left behind. Immigrating to Canada and not elsewhere is also because Canada is said to be a lot safer than anywhere else, especially the U.S. Has reputed to be safer than the U.S.
Why is that? Why is it you say
I'm not sure. They just said that they heard that it was safer to be safer than the U.S. as a whole. And yeah, I think that's it. Do you have any questions?
Do they have Korean towns throughout Canada or just in Toronto?
Well, the only official Koreatown is in Toronto, but there are major Korean communities in Vancouver, Coquitlam. There's also a smaller one in Montreal.
So they really like adapted to Canadian culture and stuff?
Yeah.
How old were your parents when you came here?
My parents, they were, I think around 40 or like 35.
And how old were you?
I was like grade 4.
So you were born there?
Oh, I was born in China. I'm half Korean, half Chinese.
Oh, okay.
So, since this kind of relates to my project somewhat, how, like you said, they came here for more opportunities. Did they also like bring their culture from back in Korea to here and like expand it, or like did they kind of just like conform to like Canadian standards?
Do you like still practice your culture here in Canada still?
Like me or the interviewer?
Both.
Okay, well, I think it speaks for both of us, like both me and the interviewees. Like we try to practice our cultures as much as we can, like at home and then at home and stuff. But we do try to fit in with the Canadian society as much as we can.
Okay. Well, that's it.
Alright, so first of all, my theme of the project is the Chinese immigration, their motivation and current situation in Canada in 21st century. Okay, so first I need to explain these 8 pictures. 4 of them are black and white and 4 of them are colored. So the black and white ones, you see the first one is about this one is about the head tax in 19th century about Chinese immigrant. And these two are obviously we can see like Chinese immigrant in Canada in 19th century, they are doing the such like labor work, right? But now in 21st century, they change and they can run a restaurant and which is not allowed in 19th century. And although some of them are still doing the labor work, but they change. So let's start the presentation. So the Chinese community in Canada has a long history dating back to the 19th century. It's interesting what urges so many Chinese people coming here to this land since 19th century and how they live now in 21st Canada. So we'll talk about Chinese immigration in Canada in the next few minutes. Trend. With the implement of the immigration policy and Chinese economic development, more and more Chinese come to Canada with different motivations in the 21st century. As this chart shows, it's quite interesting that Chinese immigration is always one of the top 3 in recent years, with no significant growth. As we all know that many Chinese people came here in 19th century for a better life. However, since the Reformation of China happened, the motivation will be changed. And it is also interesting how they live now in Canada. In other words, do they realize their dream for coming here? As I said before, the presentation will be divided into 2 parts. One is motivation and one is current situation.
Very organized.
Motivation.
let's start with the motivation part. After doing some research, I found a report about Chinese immigration motivation in 21st century. Unfortunately, it is found from a Chinese website as the screenshot beside shows. In a word, all the motivation can be listed for 10 points. Children's education, self-education, get the identity, convenience for international traveling, get the benefits from welfare, self-development, future of the family, the Western lifestyle, not satisfied with the current life, stick with the fashion. This is a chart shows the Chinese population distribution in Canada. It's pretty obvious that Vancouver has a great amount of population overall. So in the interview part, I picked 3 of my interviewees in Vancouver. Let's see. These are the screenshots of the interview transcriptions from these interviews. A lot of great information can be analyzed. After analyzing the interviews comparing to the report I mentioned before, the motivations from these 3 interviewees can be concluded into 3 points. Okay. Stick with the fashion, the future of family, and follow the parents. But the last one is pretty special because it is excluded from the report I mentioned, and it cannot be considered as a motivation because there's no subjective reason. Yeah, so it's really special. Okay, current situation. I'm really satisfied with my life now. That's all 3 interviewees. Through interviews. Furthermore, they can perfectly represent 3 groups of Chinese people by age and 2 groups of people by income. Okay, by age, the first one is the youth, and the middle age, and the old. And by income, there's the middle class and wealthy class. So in a word, the life and the lifestyle of Chinese really changed since they moved to Canada. It's subjective and obvious. And from these interviews, one thing we can know is that the current situation of Chinese people is not bad, and most of them are satisfied with it. Finally, there's a Chinese biography from Mr. Chen, one of my interviewees. It's from a very popular poem in China, which means I'm satisfied with my life now, and I believe that tomorrow will be even better. Thank you. My reference, and they are my interviewees' information. So the physical one is here. I believe here. Yeah. Any questions?
That's a Chinese poem, right?
Part of a poem, but from a poem.
Can you read it out in Chinese? I just want to hear what
Yeah. 面朝大海，春暖花开。
What does it mean?
Alright, so my socialist project is about Polish immigration in Canada. It's my aunt's great-grandfather and great-grandmother's story. So I'm going to tell you guys the story in perspective from my aunt, because if I do it from their relations to me, it gets like quite confusing with in-laws and stuff. So both of her grandparents were Polish and German descent. Their mother was Polish, father was German. And her grandfather fought for Germany, same with his friends. And when the Holocaust was arriving the prior years, her great-grandfather he sensed what was coming. And at the time, he was a jazz drummer. And he heard that Winnipeg was going to become like Chicago North. Do you guys know what Chicago North is? It's kind of like a strong nightlife, like underground for like jazz players. So he actually immigrated to Winnipeg in 1925. He left behind all his siblings, his parents, his nieces, and his nephews. For this, her great-grandfather was not alive during the time of the Holocaust, as he passed around 10 years prior to World War II. Her great-grandmother was alive during the invasion of the Nazis and taken into Lodz ghetto and killed by the Nazis, either from starvation or a disease caused by poor living conditions in the ghetto. Now, this is a ghetto. This is my diagram. It's pretty much during the invasion, they crammed a large population of Jewish people into an area like this. They were horribly disease-ridden, poor living conditions. This sign says Wong Beit der Juden Bertrand Verboten, which is direct translation to English for residential neighborhood of Jews entering prohibited.
Wait, so it was like a concentration camp kind of?
No, it was a little bit different for concentration camp. This is where all the Jewish people were put in a small area, and then they would sit there, and then they were taken to concentration camps from there.
Okay, so it's kind of like a temporary in between kind of.
Yeah, it's like in between. It's like the middle step. So, her great grandmother passed away from starvation or the living conditions involved in the ghettos. Now, the last transport was what was at the end of the Holocaust. It was basically the last transportation of Jews from the ghetto to the concentration camp, and it was en route to Auschwitz. And my auntie's grandfather, brother, and sister were both on it, and they were eventually killed in Auschwitz. So from her family, almost every single person was killed. There was about 3 survivors who actually made it to Canada. Her grandfather, after he came to Canada, or after he came to Winnipeg for Chicago North, what he thought was going to be a good nightlife for upcoming jazz drummer, he actually passed away 6 years later because he was having his tonsils removed and he had a heart attack and they didn't know what to do. So he passed 5 or 6 years after immigrating. So her granny remarried and changed her last name. And when she was asking her granny, because my aunt was very interested in this type of stuff, she found that a lot of the people wouldn't talk about their experiences with the Holocaust because her granny especially felt very guilty that she was in Canada and her friends, relatives were in Poland and they were being killed by the Nazis. So she was horribly guilt-ridden and she would never ask questions, so her information that she got was limited. But her granny actually told her that after she moved to Canada, she knew when her friends' relatives died because they would stop writing her from the ghettos. So the one survivor from her family came out was her grandfather's niece. Her name was Sabina Zicker, and she was trained to be a lawyer in 1930 and fought and protected her mom until the last transport where her mom was taken to Auschwitz. The end result was that my auntie's mom and her parents were the only ones who actually got out. Her grandfather died in Winnipeg in 1931 from the tonsil situation, but his brothers and sisters and in-laws and most of his nieces all went to the concentration camp Auschwitz or Chelmno. So the last transportation to Auschwitz, her great uncle's name was Rachmiel Glitzberg, and her great aunt was named Sizia Sikir. So her great uncle Rachmiel was a very wealthy man, and actually during the Holocaust or prior to the invasion, he tried to save his family. He actually went 3 times to Palestine and Israel. First time he went, he bought a big apartment in Tel Aviv where he was hoping to get his whole family over and help them save the invasion. Then he went back for a second time and bought a vacant property to build an apartment, and then he opened a very large bank account to support him and his family, and then he came back to get his family and friends, but the invasion had already happened and they had already been taken away. So he was captured along with his family. The last transport went out in 1944 to Auschwitz, and that was when the remainders were taken. So another comment from her grandmother was that the reason that the Holocaust was so easy because the Polish people actually had a pre-existing dislike for Jews, so they weren't very opposed to the idea of mass murder. So during the invasion, they were told to immigrate. The reasons that some of them immigrated to Canada was my auntie's great-grandparents on her dad's sides. Their names were the Markels. They were actually cattlemen of Lithuania, and they were promised land if they immigrated to Canada, so they came to Birds Hill, Manitoba. And an interesting story from one of her friends was that they were on a train into the prairies, but they hopped off and they said it was so cold, and they went to the train operator, and the train operator said if you stay on, it'll get warmer. So they actually ended up in Vancouver, BC. Now for the artifacts, this is a book of Lud's Ghetto. So this was where my auntie's grandparents were taken. And if you go to page 406, right here, this was the last liquidation at the Lud's Ghetto. So this was the remaining people in the ghetto. And I know for a fact that my auntie's grandfather and grandmother were somewhere in here. And this was the final transport to Auschwitz. And I know that my auntie's brother, or her grandfather's brother and sister were in this one. Now, these are assortment of artifacts. This is the ship that they immigrated to Canada on. It's called the Tsaritsa. I don't have too much pronunciation with that. And some facts about the ship. So these right here, this was the Lud's Ghetto list. This is this ghetto, and this is the model of the ghetto. This is where my family was taken. If you look, everyone with the name Glitzberg at the end, that's my relatives. And if you look under, it shows where they were taken from Poland, Lodz, so that's when they were actually in the ghetto, and it shows whether they died here. Glitzberg Bina, that was my auntie's grandmother. She died in 1942 in the ghetto from natural causes. Here is actually this is a copy of the original Nazi documents. So if you look, these arrows with Glitzberg, those are my relatives there. And right here, if you look here, this overpass, this was in Lodz, and this is so people could get from one side to another, but because they weren't allowed through the road because it was marked off the fence, and that's actually that right there in my model. Yeah, thanks. And this right here is actually, it's in German, but this is a account of everyone in the Auschwitz concentration camp. I translated some, so if you look under, it says nationality here, it's all marked as Hebrew for all the relatives. And this is their immigration records to Canada. So as you see, Esther, Lily, and Mosek Glitzberg were the only ones who actually immigrated to Canada. Mosek Glitzberg was the man who died of a tonsil removal when he had a heart attack during the surgery. And this is the passengers list of the ship that brought them to Canada. It went from Lithuania and ended up in New York and Halifax. And Lily Glitzberg, that's my great grandmother there. So as you can see, she was only 2 when she came. Any questions?
Wait, so they used this bridge because they weren't allowed on the road?
Yeah, the road went through the separation,
Okay.
because that was the only way to get through the ghetto, and people weren't allowed in and out of the ghetto.
Okay, so there were like fences along here.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Anything else? Thank you.
Dude, that's so good. I'll give you
Exactly 10 minutes.
Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Cultural Center. I will be your tour guide for the day. Feel free to ask me any questions throughout the tour. First of all, I will talk about the board I have in the background. So what I did was I split into 3 sections. Since we're doing Ukrainian immigration, I put life back in the Soviet. It's like a comparison. I put life back in the Soviet Union. That's why you can see the propaganda posters and pictures of Stalin. And here in the middle is when the Ukrainians first got off the boat in Canada, where they landed, and there you can see them settling in. They were mostly farmers, settling in, and then here it's after a couple of years, and then they were proudly they were proud to call themselves Canadian, and they served in the Canadian military during World War II. And on the right is how gradually the Ukrainians have integrated themselves with the Canadian culture. As you can see here, there's a Canadian postal stamp to remember the Ukrainians. There's a statue of a Ukrainian hero There are now festivals in the prairie provinces and Ontario, Toronto to celebrate the Ukrainian culture. And here is the largest Easter egg in the world is located in Alberta, Canada. Here are some churches and some posters for the Ukrainian festivals. So first of all, Ukrainian Canadians have had one of the biggest impacts on the cult development of Canada of all the ethnic groups that have immigrated to this multicultural land. Along with the British, French, and Scottish settlers, Ukrainian immigrants make up one of the largest groups to come to Canada. They settled in the West and wove their culture deeply into the fabrics of Canadian society. Did you know that today in Canada, Canada hosts the third largest Ukrainian population in the world, only behind Ukraine and Russia itself. Also, since the Ukrainians immigrated very early to when Canada was just starting to become a country, 1 in 10 Canadians can trace their ancestry back to Ukraine. Also, Ukrainian is the 5th most spoken language in the country. My focus period for this presentation will be around between the years 1892 and 1939, and what the immigrants did to create the rich culture in the new home that even today remains an essential part of the Canadian identity. First of all, I want to talk briefly about the push and pull factors that led to the immigration to Canada. So by the late 19th century, Russian rule over Ukraine had turned into brutal oppression. Russian soldiers were posted throughout the Ukraine, and the peasantry were harassed, abused, and arrested with little provocation. While Russia was beginning to industrialize, and with the abolition of serfdom, wealth was beginning to flow to cities. Then Ukraine was kept in a third world poverty state. A drought and a famine added to the general misery of the people. At the same time, the young Canadian government was looking for people to help build the railroad and also to settle into the West because they needed a large population to settle into the West, so the Americans can't claim the land for themselves. So the Canadian, one very clever Canadian ambassador, his name was Roy, he drew many similarities between the prairie provinces and the Black Steppes of Ukraine. The Ukrainians were mostly farmers, and Canada needed hardy farming settlers to build the West. So Roy and Abbott, they drew up plans to attract Ukrainians with free land, immediate citizenship, and all expense paid travel. Like, who wouldn't want that, right? The Canadian government officials began to market the posters, and they posted the immigration posters all over the Ukrainian countries and everywhere, and they targeted mainly the Ukrainian travelers who would later on bring word back to their homeland of the riches and the new opportunities they got in the new country. The first wave of immigration began in 1892, and it was led by a man called Ivan Pilipov and Wasyl Aliniak. Ukrainian immigration was largely agrarian-based, and first Ukrainians concentrated in the prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. Apparently 170,000 Ukrainians from the Austro-Hungarian Empire arrived in Canada from 1891 to 1914. Then the second wave of immigration was different. It wasn't. It was mainly influenced by the struggle for independence between the Russian Civil War. Roughly 70,000 more Ukrainians arrived between the years 1923 and 1939. The majority became workers in the working southern Ontario, the mines, smelters, and forests of northern Ontario. According to an interviewee whose name he said would prefer to be anonymous, in 1892 to 1939 is regarded as the golden age of Ukrainian immigration, because in these years, immigration, from a cultural perspective, because in these years, immigration was a necessity, and therefore, the immigrants brought their culture with them and tried desperately to preserve the traditions. However, later on in the years, as time passed, immigration became less about refuge and instead was driven by economic and social causes. A lot of the new generation immigrants came looking for individual success. They wanted to leave their life of poverty behind in Ukraine and completely reestablish themselves in the new country. This meant that a lot of culture was left behind, as well as they assimilated with the society. The Ukrainian culture runs deep, especially throughout the prairie provinces. Hearing the language spoken, eating the traditional dishes, or even seeing the brightly colored national dress is common in very many areas of provinces that has become for many part of their shared culture. Today, those of Ukrainian heritage might define themselves as being part of a thriving cultural community that encourages belonging, preservation, and development of the language and tradition, a strong political will, and an interest, if not love, for Ukrainian arts, including dance, music, film, and literature. Culture is essential to Ukrainian people. Unlike some other ethnic groups, Ukrainians have worked very hard not only to preserve their unique culture, but also to introduce it to their Canadian neighbors. Organizations such as the AUUC and the UNFC have been founded over the years for these purposes. But how exactly did they do this when they came here, when they had nothing? When they came to Canada, they literally brought nothing. They were packed onto a boat. They came here, and all they had was a backpack with no money, no land, no power whatsoever. And it took them a while to settle in. A lot of people came in 1892, and it took them around 20, maybe 30 years to settle in, get a farm, buy oxen, chickens, and they were mostly farmers, so they each had a lot of land as the Canadian government promised them free land. And after they settled in, a lot of people gathered together and they created cultural centers within their communities, and they taught the children Ukrainian language, and they always had these events. And here's a interview I did of a person, and she was talking to me about she gave me an excerpt from the diary of her grandmother. Her name wishes to be anonymous, so I'm just going to read the diary. It's a very short excerpt. The grandmother said, in 1914, we organized in Lanuk an educated association named after Palik and built our first Ukrainian Farmers Temple. It would be nice to name all of the founders in the Palik Reading Hall, but I will only mention several of them, namely Andrew Buck and Nicholas Krappel in Vancouver, William Heumann in Lanuk, and Peter Teresio in Two Hills. Our organization later linked up with the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association. We studied and carried out our cultural work as best as we knew. We presented plays on stage under Nicholas Krappel's direction. Later, our director, who is now living at Edmonton, he organized a mandolin orchestra with which we went on tours in neighboring districts. Some of the younger people still mention these concerts. We also had a choir. We organized a branch of the women's section of the Ukrainian Labor Farmer Temple Association. We held educational meetings, which we were able to be attended by our children. We made every effort to teach our children to be upright, good people. We especially took a strong stand against drinking because drunkenness brings shame on both the individual and the community as a whole. Both my husband and I have been responsible positions in the organization. I was a recording secretary for many years, and I used to do prompting during the performance of plays. I have also written some articles for our press, especially for the magazine Rabitnitsia. Now that I have reached an old age, I have many happy memories of our organizational work. We continue to read the progressive press and are interested in cultural education and community activities. With the collective efforts of many like her, this amazing culture was able to be passed down nearly unchanged. It is said that the Ukrainian identity in Canada is so strong it rivals that of Ukraine. I have a quote here. It says, over 120 years ago, the Ukrainians arrived and helped build this province. The quote is from Danilo Pudurak, who is an executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress in Saskatchewan. Our members are still nation builders today by preserving and growing the Ukrainian Canadian culture, identity, and aspiration in the province. We have been able to develop strong communities with such much civic pride, support for provincial immigration efforts, and add to Canada's vibrant multicultural identity. Today, when I talked to some of the interviewees, I went to a place in Vancouver. It's called the St. Mary's Catholic Ukrainian Church, and they have like a whole neighborhood of Ukrainians. They have apartments, they have a community center, they have a church. And a lot of people I talked to, they all said culture was probably the #1 focus for them, and culture was very, very important in their society. They all came to church regularly, and they all come together regularly to share their stories and eat the Ukrainian food so they can preserve the culture. And they also like to stay together. and it's more of the older generations that told me this. But as I said before, the younger generations now are more driven by economic success, so a lot of the cultural aspects were left behind. So now I'm gonna talk to you guys briefly about the individual aspects of culture. First of all, I will talk about food. Food was a very, very big thing in Ukraine, and they had a lot of. The Ukrainian food is often defined by its distinct taste, the use of many different sauces, and the simplicity. As you can see, these pierogies are a signature in the Ukrainian cuisine. It is simply made with potatoes and maybe some cheese or bacon. And here I have some food. You guys want to try it?
Do I want to try it?
This is pierogi, and these are Ukrainian sausages. Here you guys can take a plate and get a fork. Okay, definitely, sir. Nice.
What is that?
It's a sour cream. If you guys like it.
It looks weird without a beard.
Oh man. Just come here and you can grab as much as you want. Oh.
Probably limit it to like 1 or 2 each.
And also you might wait. Don't eat it yet. Don't eat it yet. You guys have to eat it with sour cream. It's a lot better. But I can't open it.
Yeah, sure.
I've never tried it before.
Seriously?
I tried like one.
I already ate mine. Are they dope? Yeah. Thanks, buddy. I would 3. Do you have a lot?
Alright, so you guys, I'll leave the sour cream here, and you guys can take some and put it in your plate.
What the hell are you doing? Sorry, it was not my chin. Yo, can I get the double plate? I just put a balls in it, and then I wasn't expecting this.
Thanks, dude.
No problem, man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Is there enough in the sample?
There's 3 more trays.
Like, surprisingly, it's like really plain, but then it's really good.
Because they were very poor. They were mostly farmers.
It's just like
So,
potato.
they all found the easiest way to make these dishes. So go ahead, sir. There's plates over there and forks if you.
I don't need a plate.
You guys.
Oh, hey, Jude. How you doing? How's your project?
Pretty good. You present? No, yeah. Family recipe? Oh, hey, Bob. Yeah. Maybe?
Yes. Yeah.
Like the olive grenadine.
No, I didn't. There's the last one in that batch. And
Yeah,
then-
could I have one?
Yeah, go ahead.
4. Who's better than
Now this is oh, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna bring the other one from the ground to replace this tray over here.
food is always a good idea.
And I'm not sure which one you guys got, but there's different flavors. There's ones with ham, bacon. There's one with normal potato, and there's and then there are ones with potato and cheese.
Next time we should try these ones too. Yeah,
Sample these.
good idea.
I feel like these are cheese, and yeah, I'm a BS sample.
I feel like Mike is getting 100.
Like,
Are you rating this one? I think I might take another.
yeah, I got
Just
like
to, I need to test them.
All right, well, you guys listen. I'm gonna continue with my presentation. All right? No, can you just like
We're back up.
back off a little bit? Just like stand
Let's
to
go
that
back
side.
off a little bit.
Yeah, let's leave some for the later people who will come later.
Sure.
Make sure you eat it with sour cream. It's actually really good.
Right, of course. I forget the sound.
I have a photo album here to show you more of. This is only the very simple kind of Ukrainian cuisine, and here there's other ones. There's a Ukrainian tradition that when you greet, actually Mr. Billick told me this. He told me in Ukraine, when you greet people, you have a cake, and then in the middle there's a bunch of salt, and then everyone will grab a piece of cake and then dip it in the salt and eat it. And that was like a very long-lasting tradition. And some of the other foods that are also very famous in Ukraine, let's see, are these potato pancakes.
Oh, dude, I love those.
Latkes?
There are, these are cabbage rolls. These are, you also eat with sour cream, and then usually in a meal they will put cabbage rolls and these pierogies and some other things together to make like a full plate. And if you keep going on, these are stew, more pancakes. The pastries are really good, and donuts, and yeah, I just have a bunch of pictures of the food in Ukraine. Next, I'm going to talk about Easter egg painting, which is probably the most defining tradition of Ukraine. It dated back to around 200 AD, I think. This is very important because they started doing this because of their religion. A lot of the things they would paint on the eggs would symbolize the gods that they used to worship, and now it has changed. Now it's kind of like a tradition for everyone, like children, to paint. I have these eggs. They weren't made properly because I couldn't really do it. But this is basically what an egg would look like in Ukraine. And then the proper way to make these would be, first you would poke a hole in the bottom. You would leak all the yolk out, and then you would make it dry, and then put a layer of some kind of preservative on it. And then later you would use a wax pen, and then you would paint over it, and then later in the end you would spray coloring over to coat everything and make it really shiny. It's a very delicate process, and it's a very big part of Ukrainian tradition. Feel free to like look at the eggs if you want.
Can I touch it? Can I pick it up?
Sure, if you want.
It's actually pretty cool. You did
My
it
sister
yourself?
did this, but
Were they
I made this one.
responsible for, the Easter egg coloring thing?
Yeah, usually everyone, a lot of people, they would do it, they would usually use a white egg, but sometimes they don't want to color in the background themselves, or they don't have the proper equipment to color it in. So what they would do is they would boil onion peels. They would take onion peels, they would take the purple onion peels, they would boil it in water for about 5 to 10 minutes, and that will give the water a nice red to purple kind of coloring. And then you would put the egg in afterwards to boil without taking out the yolk, of course, and then it will give it a really very rich color. And then so you can just directly draw the designs on them without having to worry about filling in the white spaces. And that was something I found really interesting. Something else I'm going to talk about is the embroidery and the clothing. That also, embroidery is very important in Ukrainian culture. As you can see, this is a very, very traditional piece of clothing. It's called a vyshyvanka. It's there's embroidery in the chest area and in the two sleeves. And a lot of the Ukrainian embroidery looks much like this, and they all have similar patterns. As you can see, these are more vyshyvankas that people wear traditionally.
It's very colorful.
Yeah, and these are kind of like the similar designs. All the Ukrainian embroidery kind of looks like this. And these. Okay, lastly, I'm also going to talk about the religion. Most Ukrainians, they came from two different parts. They were either Roman Catholic or Orthodox. And when they came here, they definitely preserved their religion. And when they came here, they built a lot of pioneer churches. But a lot of the church designs were different from when they were back in Ukraine, because they were built from memory. And so it wasn't so this church would be something that was very, very traditional in Ukraine, and it was a very big scale. But then here they were, yeah, some of them like that. Yeah, but then when they came here, they were very poor, and they didn't have the materials, and they also had to build it from memory. They just tried to build it as much as they could. And also some of the local Roman Catholic designs kind of influenced this architecture. So this, I think, Oh dang, it's covered. But this was the first church that was built by an Ukrainian community when they came to Canada. Right here, this is the church.
Is it still standing?
And you can see it's definitely nowhere near as good as that one, and the designs are different because they had to chop up the lumber and everything themselves instead of like a big scale architectural event like that.
Where is that? Do you know
This
where
is
that
in Alberta. This is Alberta. A lot of the stuff is mainly in Alberta. Lastly, I am going to talk about music and dancing, which is like Ukrainian dancing is huge. As you can see on these posters, it's all about the dancing. Like at every festival you go to, when the word Ukraine is mentioned, there's always dancing. Dancing was a tradition since the very beginning, and it has changed a lot in Ukraine and in Canada. The culture of dancing in Canada is more contemporary than the one in Ukraine, and the Ukraine one was more traditional. And then these are some of the pictures that like the dances would look something like that. And I also have a video clip of the dance that that they performed at this festival right here. It was on stage. So if you guys can just look, I'll play it for a minute or so. Yeah. Yeah, and the dancing is always very large scale because like everyone in the community will be involved with it, and yeah, that's just, and yeah, basically that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Where's that big egg from? Is that Cotton Eye?
Here,
Yeah.
it's from someplace in Alberta. It's the world's largest. It's called a pisanki.
Yeah.
Pisanki. Pisanka. Yeah, and that's the largest Easter egg in the world.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that's Cotton Eye or Easter. Very small town.
I thought it was pretty important because like it's kind of like the Ukrainians built their biggest structure in Canada.
It's a big attraction.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, basically. Thank you so much. I'm done with presentation. How long you can pause it?
So my project's about my family and immigration process from China to Canada. So first off, I asked myself, why did we decide to immigrate to Canada? So I turned to my dad, which is one of my interviewees, and I asked him why. Why did I get sent here with my brother and my family? So he said, to start off, the culture in the education in Canada, the teaching style is very different from China, and because in China they use strict techniques and memorization just to like let you know stuff, but they don't actually let you interact with each other. So in Canada, in the schools, the teachers have different techniques overall. So they get us to interact and to talk to each other or like figure out ways to find a solution instead of just giving us the solution and telling us to memorize it. And that's one reason why my dad decided to make us immigrate here. And another reason is because English is one of the most widely spoken language in the world. So it'll be really useful for us to learn English here. And so later on, if we decide to go travel around the world, we would communicate better. So before we left, we were discussing what kind of problems we might face. The first obvious problem would be language, since my mom didn't know any English and my dad knew only little English, and because me and my brother went to New Zealand for 2 years, so we got to know English first. So, and another problem that we might face is lacking friends and families to help us get started from settling here. So once we arrived, so first of all we flew to PEI, Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown, as our first landing point, and it was an experience that because it's like going to a foreign country that you don't know anything about, and everything is so strange and different from what we used to know. So, but luckily we met some people from the same situation as us, so we can help each other in the process of settling down. So we stayed there for like 1 year or so, and we decided to go to Vancouver since that was a major point, that was a major city, because a lot of Chinese immigrants went to Vancouver. So we decided to drive all the way across Canada in our little car, and we eventually arrived here. So first we needed to organize all our homes and education. So we only mostly relied on my brother because he was like the guy that organized everything. So after that, when we got into our school, we didn't really interact with the local kids because we found some other Chinese immigrants, so we usually just talked to them instead of the kids at the school. So we had to face that problem as communication. So later, so that leads to the biggest problem that we face, which is language. And for my mom, it would be the hardest to deal with because she has no knowledge of English at that time. And another point is for all the immigrants right now, if we want to be a citizen, we have to take the Canadian citizenship test. Anybody above 18 years or older, yeah, and 55 or below. So my mom had to study really hard, and as you can see from this notebook, all these writings just for the test. I think she studied harder than me. And all of these are actually really hard questions that I don't even think I know. So, yeah, and in this chart, we can see that in the 2008 edition Canadian Citizen test, the failure rate was only 4%. And right above 2010, March 15th, they reworked the test, and then it suddenly increased to 30% failure rate. So, and then later they decided to rework it again, and it dropped down to 20%. But that's still a big leap from 4%. So many of the parents of the immigrants failed, and they had to retake it or just not take it at all. So eventually my mom took it and we passed, so now we're Canadian citizens. And there's a test online that you can take. You can choose how many questions you want and then begin the test. These are the tests that should be on the real test. These are questions, and you can just do it and see if how many you can get right. So yeah, thank you.
So as far as you guys know right now, many non-European immigrants who decided to immigrate to Canada were not really treated equally, and this is mainly because in the early 1900s, the nation of Canada wanted to keep its main population European. However, it's quite a different story for my culture. What I'm studying is a Sikh immigration to Canada, as an overall in the early 1900s. And I'm going to start off with the timeline. I just want to say that the story starts off very differently. It starts with respect and trust, and it slowly moves into inequality because the government starts worrying. So this would be the main timeline. In 1887, 4 Sikh soldiers came to Canada from Hong Kong, celebrating Queen Victoria's Jubilee. Now, these men decided to come because they liked the nice climate and the good farmland. There was no other reason, but the only problem was they were never allowed to bring their wives with them. And then in 1904, quite a jump, the first large amount of Sikh immigrants arrive in one go, and that would be 258 Sikhs. Now, when they arrived, the press depicted them like this. As you can see, it's quite a crude drawing, and it's quite disrespectful, seeing they're all crammed in one boat. That's how they imagined they came. And but when they came, a lot of people hired them because of their work ethic. They worked as hard as possible whenever they could. Now, in 1907, there was a huge problem and a huge rise up, and the Sikhs were denied the right to vote within Canada. And here you see a group of Sikh men outside their house, and around about, on average, 20 men lived in a house which would be quite small, like a townhouse, for example. And then, just a year after, in 1908, the government tried to deport all Sikh men out into the British Honduras, a nation which was within the Caribbean. Now, they used things such as there's a nice climate there and there's fantastic farmland. The exact reasons they came to Canada. They were just trying to get them out of Canada, but the Sikh men who were already there decided that they were trying to trick them, and they wanted to stand their ground, and so they did for the next few years. And these are some Sikhs who are about to board the CPR, and they were almost forced into boarding it. Now, from 1904 to 1908, 5,000 Sikh men arrived within that time period. And this would be one of the first Sikh temples. No one knew about it. It was not exactly legal, as it didn't have forms of licensing or anything, but it still exists to this day, and it is now legal. And it's caused a lot of spirit in the community, seeing the main pivotal point of all Sikh communities are the Sikh temples, or otherwise known as the Gurdwaras. And seeing that they had one now, they felt happy, and they felt that they could fight this fight against the government who were trying to kick them out of Canada. In 1911, just over 2,500 Sikhs left Canada since the first immigration wave of 5,000 people, and they all left due to inequality. This just shows what kind of hardship they went through. The men who came here on the hardest waves ever, and they had to go through the worst situations. They weren't able to bring their children or anything, and they had to sacrifice so much, yet they wanted to leave because it was such an unequal land. Now, in this image, you see in 1911, there was a Sikh man on horseback. He was the first person to actually fully control the European workers. He was telling them exactly what to do with the lumber, and this has never been done before. Usually, they were the laborers, but as you can see, he had a leadership position in Canada, and this was the first ever leadership position for a Sikh man. Now, these were in 1912, the first legal Gurdwaras were built in various locations, such as Duncan, Vancouver, and Victoria. The first legal Gurdwara would be here. It's called Paldi, and you can find it around Duncan. Nowadays, the village has been burnt down. In about 2005, the government decided they had enough because apparently Paldi was not paying the bills and everything that they could to run. So the only thing remaining in there is now one small little box-like thing where there's 4 people there who still pray to this day. And skipping ahead about 2 years, there was a ship called the Komagata Maru, which set sail for Vancouver to challenge the continuous journey clause. the continuous journey basically stated that you need $200 if you are a non-European immigrant, and if you were European, you only had to bring $20 with you. Now these men, 376 passengers in total, mainly Sikh, were on board the Komagata Maru, and they were planning on getting off and into Vancouver illegally. And over here you can see some men who were on board the Komagata Maru. Now again, in 1914, when they got to docks and they arrived, the Komagata Maru was escorted out of Vancouver by the Canadian Navy. And the police, this is an image of the police surrounding the Komagata Maru and escorting it out of the docks. And funny thing about the Komagata Maru is the men never starved of anything. They were never thirsty because they were use their genius to make the Canadian government give them food forcefully. They went on a fast until they got good quality food. And in 1918, the Sikh population, before it was 2,500, about 10 years ago, now it's only 700 in all of Canada. And the Gurdwara built in Duncan, BC, was rebuilt, and it was named after a village in India. Now it's called Kaldi, after one of the men's favorite villages. And here in this image you can see two Sikh men walking alongside some more European immigrants who were in the military. And as you can see, there was starting to be equality culturally, but legally there was such segregation that everybody thought that there would never be equality again. But then in 1919, Sikh females were allowed to enter Canada. Now, if you think about it, some men were waiting for 33 years to see their wives and children. And this is a picture of them first meeting their wives and children for the first time in 33 years. And they promised they'd never marry anyone else. They'd never had any other children. And they waited this long, and because they knew that their families would come one day. They believed in them. And the women started arriving in 1920. And that is the main timeline. Now I'm going to move on to, now you understand the kind of stuff the Sikh man went through in that period of around about 33 years. I'm going to go to this, which is basically explaining the kind of what they felt inside of them. So there's the first thing I realized was that no Sikh man was allowed to bring his family with him, as the PowerPoint stated. And Sikhs who immigrated to Canada before the World War were paid as little as $1 to $2 per day. So that's why they lived in such large groups as 20 men. The third fact was the land and climate were not hostile, but the people definitely were, as you saw. They relied on each other. There was a very strong community between them all, and they trusted in that community for a very long time. Almost to this day, the community of the Sikh community overall, they trust themselves, each other. And the main reason most Sikhs came was because of the good climate in Vancouver. And none of them ever actually went over to the East Coast because they didn't want that. They wanted Vancouver's climate. Now the final thing on this is the quote from a man called Jutbal. He was one of the 4 soldiers of the first immigration in 1887, and he said their intention was to make money and return to India. They came to a cold and hostile environment, both literally and figuratively. Besides language problems, poor education, lack of proper housing and healthcare, and culture shock, they faced racial discrimination and segregation. So he's basically explaining what a Sikh man felt every day, as these quotes do. And I also have a letter I found, and it was from one of the first immigrants as well, and it was to his wife, and I'll just read it out for a second. I have arrived safely in Canada, yet it was an even more hostile environment than the wreck of a ship that brought me here. However, it is hostile in a different way. The climate is nice, The farmland is better than the land that my ancestors owned in my village. But the people are as cold and harsh as the waves that smashed against the ship that brought me here to Canada. I am writing to you now because I have some terrible news. You and your 3 children will never be able to come here, and I will never be able to leave. I hope that you think this is unjust as I did the first time. The words crept towards my ears. I've heard of a ship that has recently come to the docks. Its name is the Komagata Maru. It is full of Sikhs, and for that reason, they will never be able to leave that ship. It breaks my heart that they have tormented and imprisoned, day by day. Does the corrupt government of this nation do anything to help? It doesn't. Does that mean that all people who enter this nation are completely free? Not at all. Yours truly, Preetham Singh. So that was what it's like in the early 1900s. Now, for my interview, I interviewed my grandfather, who came in 1970, and he didn't decide to fully settle, but he experienced the entire immigration. And the main facts I found about him were a few letters. I'm just going to go through some of them. The first 2 are basically explaining he can't teach in Canada, plainly because he is Indian, and they don't rely on him because he is Indian. I'm just going to pass them around here if you want to read through them yourselves. And so if you read through them, you realize that they're not that offensive. They are quite polite, but their undertone is basically stating, you're Indian, you cannot come to Canada and teach that because you don't know English.
It's brutal.
Yep, and my grandfather wanted to give me this because he wanted to show that the reason he came to Canada was for equality that didn't even exist in his homeland in India. And as you can see, his marriage form wasn't a Sikh marriage form, is a Hindu marriage, because Sikh marriages weren't allowed in his area, and that's the main reason he decided to come to Canada. And the last form I have, it states that his religious denomination is none. That he called them for 30 straight years over and over again trying to change his religious denomination to Sikh, but they decided not to because they said it's simply not popular enough religion to go into our forms. So you can see right here it states that there is no religious denomination with just a cross in the middle. And I set up a little thing. There's rafts with showing the immigration waves, and as you can see, it starts off with 52,000 Sikhs strong in just a margin of 6 years, and then in 1911 to 1920, drops down to 107, and then it goes 1921 to 1930, 400, and as you can see, 107 to 400. I think this can be explained by the fact that the World War occurred, and because those countries fighting against each other, they had to come to certain treaties stating that they had to be more equal culturally and physically, and then the Canadian government took away some of the laws which did not allow Sikh people to enter the nation. And then it increased to 253 Sikh people, and then it's 349, and then after the Second World War, they started going to the 3,000s, and by the time that the 60s came, there were 31,000 Sikhs who showed up. So, as you can see, the immigration of Sikhs were strongly influenced by the Second World War and the First World War, mainly because Canada decided to be more equal because they saw the consequences of what could happen if they were not. And so that sums up my presentation, everyone. Is there any questions you have?